The unforgiving Texas summer heat distorted the air above the melting asphalt of a forgotten highway gas station, where the heavy scent of diesel fumes tangled with the bitter aroma of day-old coffee and ancient dust. A pair of worn, scuffed leather boots stepped out of an ordinary pickup truck, moving with the quiet, unhurried grace of a man who had absolutely nothing left to prove to the world. Inside the dimly lit convenience store, a raw, angelic voice pouring its soul into a heartbreaking country classic was suddenly and violently crushed by the shrill, arrogant scream of a sharp-suited stranger. The emotional whiplash was instantaneous as the pure, undeniable beauty of a blue-collar worker. Hidden talent collided head-on with the cruel impatience of a man who believed his wealth bought him the right to humiliate others. Standing unnoticed in the shadows of the snack aisle, the king of country music stopped dead in his tracks. The stale air inside the store seemed to freeze solid, setting the stage for an inevitable, devastating collision between empty, loud arrogance and the silent, towering authority of a true Texas legend. The sun beat down on the dusty trail's fuel and stopped like a hammer on an anvil, punishing the cracked earth that stretched out for miles in every direction. It was 3 in the afternoon, and the world outside was a blinding haze of white light and shimmering heat waves. The gas station sat isolated on a lonely stretch of secondary highway, flanked by nothing but resilient cactuses and endless miles of barbed wire fencing. Inside the store, the atmosphere was thick and suffocating. The overworked air conditioning unit rattled and hummed in the ceiling, fighting a losing battle against the inferno that pushed against the glass doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, irritating frequency, casting a pale, sickly glow over the aisles of canned beans, stale chips and motor oil. It was the kind of place people only stopped at when they had no other choice, a brief, dusty purgatory between one destination and another. Deep in the back of the store, standing near the coffee station, a man poured himself a cup of black coffee. He wore faded denim jeans that had seen their fair share of saddle time, a simple pearl snap shirt, and a well-worn straw hat pulled low over his brow. Dark sunglasses concealed his eyes, granting him a rare and precious anonymity. George Strait, the man whose voice had defined generations of country music, was taking a quiet detour away from the blinding lights of arenas and the relentless demands of fame. He sought the simple, honest quiet of the back roads, where a man could just be a man. He took a slow sip of the bitter dark liquid, letting the familiar taste ground him. He enjoyed these stolen moments of invisibility, watching the world go by without being the center of it. The quiet rhythm of the store was anchored by the steady swish of a wet mop against dirty linoleum. In the center aisle, a young boy who looked barely 17 years old was pushing the heavy mop back and forth. He wore a faded blue uniform shirt with a name patch that was peeling at the corners, and his hands were rough, calloused, and permanently stained with the grease of 1,000 oil changes. The boy looked exhausted, carrying a weight on his narrow shoulders that seemed far too heavy for someone his age. But to survive the crushing monotony of his invisible, underpaid labor, the boy did the only thing he knew how to do. He sang. He was not just mindlessly humming a tune to pass the time. He was delivering a visceral, soul-bearing rendition of Amarillo by Morning. His voice was a revelation. It possessed a raw, unpolished purity that could not be taught in any music school. The pitch was flawless, but it was the emotion, the deep, resonant sorrow in his timbre that commanded attention. It was a voice forged in hardship, echoing the pain of unpaid bills, sleepless nights, and dreams deferred. As he leaned into the mop handle, he closed his eyes, escaping the grime and the heat, letting the lyrics carry him away to a place where he was more than just a kid cleaning up other people's messes. The sheer beauty of his singing transformed the dingy gas station into a cathedral of sound. From the shadows, George listened intently, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his mouth. The seasoned musician recognized instantly what he was hearing. It was the undeniable sound of true God-given talent, blooming in the most barren of landscapes. The fragile magic of the moment was shattered with the violence of a thrown brick. The heavy glass door of the convenience store flew open, crashing against the metal frame. The brutal Texas heat surged inside, accompanied by the loud, aggressive voice of a man who demanded the world bend to his will. The newcomer was a middle-aged executive, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in the dusty environment. He had just stepped out of a gleaming imported luxury SUV that was parked haphazardly across 2 spaces outside. He was speaking loudly into a sleek Bluetooth earpiece, barking orders about stock portfolios and missed margins, oblivious to his surroundings. His designer leather shoes clicked sharply against the floor, ignoring the bright yellow caution sign that warned of the wet linoleum the boy had just painstakingly cleaned. The executive marched directly to the front counter, slapping his leather wallet and a set of heavy car keys down onto the chipped Formica surface. He expected immediate deference. He expected the world to stop and serve him. But the boy, lost in the emotional crescendo of his song and the rhythmic motion of his work, took a few seconds too long to register the sudden intrusion. He kept singing, his eyes still closed, the mop still gliding across the floor. Those mere seconds of delay were enough to ignite a furious rage in the impatient businessman. The man ripped the earpiece from his ear and turned his venomous glare toward the boy. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers loudly, aggressively in the air, as if calling a disobedient dog. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the store, cutting through the boy, beautiful melody like a jagged knife. "Hey, hillbilly!" The executive barked, his voice dripping with condescension and unearned superiority. "Are you paid to sing or are you paid to work? Move it. My time is worth more than this entire pathetic excuse for a building." The words struck the boy with physical force. He stopped dead, his eyes snapping open. The light that had just moments ago illuminated his face vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, familiar shame. He scrambled to pull the mop aside his shoulders, hunching inward as he tried to make himself as small as possible. The beautiful music died in his throat, leaving behind a suffocating silence. He hurried behind the counter, his worn boots slipping slightly on the wet floor he had just washed. "Yes, sir, I'm so sorry, sir," the boy mumbled, his voice trembling. His gaze fixed firmly on the cash register. He began scanning the man items, a bottle of expensive imported water and a pack of mints, with shaking hands. But the executive was not satisfied with mere compliance. He wanted to punish. He leaned over the counter, his face twisted into an ugly sneer. He looked the boy up and down, taking in the grease stains, the worn fabric, the cheap boots. He saw an easy target, a punching bag for his own frustrations. "You think you're going to get discovered out here in the middle of nowhere?" the man mocked, his tone loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "You think some record executive is going to walk through that door and hand a mop boy a contract? Listen to me, kid. You have a mediocre voice and a thick accent. Do everyone a favor and shut your mouth. You're going to die scrubbing the floor of a ghost town gas station just like the rest of the losers in this state." The cruelty of the words hung heavily in the air. The few other customers in the store, an elderly couple buying a map and a truck driver picking out a sandwich, froze. They looked down at their feet, suddenly fascinated by the dusty floor tiles, too intimidated by the rich man's aggressive aura to intervene. They felt the injustice burning in their chests, but the fear of confrontation kept them silent. The boy swallowed hard, his throat tight. Tears of profound humiliation welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision. He fought desperately to hold them back, biting the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood. He felt entirely alone, entirely worthless, stripped of his dignity in front of strangers. He handed the man his change with a trembling hand, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. If you also cannot stand seeing arrogant people humiliating honest, hard-working folks and want to see how this cruel executive received the absolute lesson of his life, you must pay close attention to what happens next. The events that are about to unfold will go down in history. Deep in the back of the store, the quiet sound of a plastic spoon stirring black coffee ceased completely. George Strait stood perfectly still in the shadows. He did not feel a sudden explosive rage. He did not feel the need to shout or throw a punch. The anger that rose within him was cold, calculated, and deeply rooted in the unbreakable values of a man raised on the land. He was a man who knew the value of a hard day work, who knew that the dirt on a man's hands was a badge of honor, not a mark of shame. He watched the boy fighting back tears, and he watched the arrogant stranger smirking with cruel satisfaction. George set his coffee cup down on the counter. The soft thud sounded like a judge gavel in the tense silence of the store. He stepped out of the shadows. He moved with deliberate slowness, his heavy leather boots thudding against the linoleum. Every step was measured, every movement exuded a quiet, terrifying authority. The truck driver and the elderly couple parted ways, allowing the tall figure in the straw hat to pass. George walked down the center aisle, his eyes fixed squarely on the back of the tailored suit. He stopped just a few feet away from the counter, standing shoulder to shoulder with the terrified boy. The executive turned his head, looking at George with immediate disdain. He saw the faded jeans, the simple shirt, the cowboy hat. He saw another nobody, another piece of local trash in his way. He opened his mouth, ready to tell the old cowboy to back off and wait his turn. He was ready to unleash another wave of venom. But George did not look at the wealthy man. He did not offer a scowl or a threat. Instead, he turned his head slightly and looked directly into the tear-filled eyes of the young boy behind the register. George did not offer a word of pity. He did not offer a comforting pat on the shoulder. He knew that pity would only deepen the boy's shame. Instead, George reached into the deepest part of his soul, drew in a breath of the stale gas station air, and did the one thing no one in that room could have ever anticipated. He opened his mouth and began to sing the exact same chorus the boy had been singing just moments before. The deep, velvety, unmistakable baritone voice rolled through the convenience store like a slow-moving thunderstorm. It was a voice that had sold millions of records, a voice that had echoed through packed stadiums and arenas across the globe, a voice that was etched into the very soul of American music. Now it was resonating between the aisles of motor oil and cheap sunglasses, vibrating against the glass doors and filling every inch of the dusty room. He sang the lyrics of Amarillo by Morning with a profound melancholic grace, pouring decades of life experience, heartache and triumph into every single note. The revelation was instantaneous and utterly paralyzing. No one needed to announce his name. No one needed to see his face clearly beneath the brim of the straw hat. The voice was the identity. The voice was the legend. The atmosphere in the room shifted so violently, it felt as though the gravity had been reversed. The power dynamic did not just change, it was completely obliterated. The executive froze mid-breath. The smug, cruel smile was wiped from his face in a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale and trembling. He stared at the man standing beside him, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible reality of what was happening. The man he had just indirectly insulted, the culture he had just mocked, was now standing right in front of him, embodied by the reigning king of country music. George kept his eyes on the boy. He offered a slow, reassuring nod, a silent, steady command from a master to an apprentice. He was telling the boy to stand up, to find his courage, to reclaim his dignity. The boy stared at George, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with disbelief. The tears of humiliation stopped, replaced by an overwhelming wave of awe. He looked at the man he had idolized his entire life, the man whose cassette tapes he had worn out in his beat-up truck. George sang the next line and then paused, leaving the space open. He nodded again, more firmly this time. The boy swallowed hard. His hands were still shaking, but something inside him ignited. A spark of defiance, a surge of pure adrenaline washed over him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and opened his mouth. He joined his voice with the legend. For the next minute, the dusty trail's fuel and stop ceased to be a forgotten roadside purgatory. It transformed into the sacred wooden stage of the Grand Ole Opry. The harmony between the two men was hauntingly beautiful. The rich, seasoned depth of George baritone wrapped perfectly around the raw, soaring purity of the boy tenor. They sang of lost rodeos and broken bones, of pride and endurance. They sang for the truck driver who wiped a tear from his eye. They sang for the elderly couple who held hands. They sang for every person who had ever been told they were not good enough. The executive stood trapped in the center of the performance, physically unable to move. He was a prisoner of his own arrogance, forced to listen to the magnificent, undeniable proof of his own ignorance. The music swelled, filling the room with an overpowering emotional weight. The boy voice grew stronger, with every word shedding the fear and the shame, rising higher and clearer, supported by the unbreakable foundation of George's Strait presence. When they reached the final note, they held it together, letting it ring out and slowly fade into the steady hum of the air conditioning. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, reverent silence, the kind that follows a miracle. The boy stood tall behind the counter, his chest heaving, a radiant smile breaking through the grime on his face. He had never felt so alive, so validated. George slowly turned his head. He looked down at the pale, trembling executive. The businessman tried to speak to offer some kind of excuse or apology, but his voice failed him. He only managed a pathetic, choked gasp. George reached up and slowly adjusted the brim of his straw hat. His expression was calm, but his eyes, hidden behind the dark glasses, radiated a fierce, protective fire. He spoke with the slow, deliberate politeness that only a true Texas gentleman could wield, a politeness that cut deeper than any shouted insult ever could. So George said, his voice low and steady, echoing in the quiet room, "Here in Texas, we have a long-standing custom of respecting a hard-working man. We respect the sweat on his brow and the dirt on his hands. And we especially respect a man when the good Lord has seen fit to put a gift in his throat that most folks on the radio would kill to have." George took a step closer, towering over the shrinking executive. "I think it would be best for everyone if you took your change, got back into your fancy car, and continued on your journey. And the next time you feel the need to look down on somebody, you might want to remember that you never know who is listening in the shadows." The executive was utterly destroyed. He did not argue. He did not demand to see a manager. He frantically snatched his keys from the counter, leaving his change and his expensive water behind. He turned and practically ran for the door, his designer shoes slipping clumsily on the wet floor he had previously ignored. He shoved the glass door open and fled into the blinding heat. Seconds later, the roar of his luxury SUV engine echoed across the asphalt, the tires squealing in a desperate, embarrassing retreat as he sped away down the highway, vanishing into the shimmering dust. Inside the store, the tension broke like a fever. The truck driver let out a loud, booming cheer, clapping his large hands together. The elderly couple smiled warmly, wiping tears from their cheeks. The boy behind the counter finally broke down. He gripped the edges of the Formica counter, his knuckles white, sobbing uncontrollably. But these were no longer tears of shame. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy and disbelief. He buried his face in his arms, overcome by the magnitude of what had just occurred. George smiled. It was a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled dollar bills, placing them on the counter to pay for his coffee. Then he walked slowly around the edge of the counter, stepping into the employee area. He placed a strong, calloused hand on the boy's shaking shoulder. The boy looked up, his face streaked with tears and grease. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I do not know what to say." "Thank you, Mr. Strait." George reached into the breast pocket of his pearl snap shirt. He pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. From it, he extracted a custom guitar pick emblazoned with his signature. He took the boy's trembling hand and pressed the pick firmly into his palm. "You do not need to thank me, son," George said softly. "You have a gift. Do not ever let anyone make you feel ashamed of where you come from or what you do to survive." George then reached for a pen resting near the cash register. He tore a small piece of blank receipt paper from the machine and wrote down a name and a phone number. He folded the paper and handed it to the boy. "This is my producer in Nashville." George explained, his tone serious and encouraging. "I want you to call him the minute your shift ends today. Tell him George sent you. Tell him he needs to hear you sing." The boy stared at the piece of paper as if it were made of solid gold. He could not speak. He could only nod, his tears falling freely onto his uniform shirt. "Keep sweeping the floor if you have to, son," George said, tipping his hat one last time. "But never let anyone silence your voice. The world needs to hear it." With that, George Strait turned and walked out the glass doors, stepping back into the brutal Texas heat. He climbed into his dusty pickup truck, started the engine, and drove away, merging onto the lonely highway. He left behind a gas station that would never be the same. A group of strangers who had witnessed a legend in action, and a young boy whose entire destiny had been rewritten in the span of 10 minutes. 5 years later, the world had changed. The dusty gas station was a distant memory, replaced by the blinding lights of a massive sold-out arena. The roar of 50,000 fans shook the concrete foundation. Standing center stage, bathed in a single spotlight, was a young man holding an acoustic guitar. He wore a sharp-tailored jacket, but his boots were still scuffed and his smile was still humble. He stepped up to the microphone, the crowd falling into a breathless hush. He raised his right hand to the sky. Pinched between his thumb and forefinger, catching the glare of the spotlight, was an old scratched guitar pick. "I want to dedicate this next song," the young man said, his voice echoing through the massive stadium, ringing with the same pure, soulful emotion it had years ago. It is my first #1 hit on the Billboard charts. But more importantly, I want to dedicate it to the man who stood in the shadows of a dirty gas station and listened to me when the rest of the world told me to shut my mouth. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar as the young man began to strum the opening chords. The music soared, carrying a message of resilience, of hope, and of the enduring power of kindness. It was a testament to the fact that true greatness is never measured by the size of a bank account or the brand of a suit. True greatness lies in the willingness to stand up for the vulnerable, to recognize the dignity in every honest day of work, and to understand that the most beautiful flowers often bloom in the most unforgiving dust. The boy who was told he would die with a mop in his hand was now singing to the world, all because a quiet cowboy decided to share his voice. The concrete walls of the massive arena vibrated with the kinetic energy of 50,000 screaming souls, a deafening tidal wave of sound that shook the very foundation of the building. Backstage, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of ozone from the stage pyrotechnics, mingling with the scent of hot electrical equipment and the nervous sweat of the crew. In a dimly lit dressing room, far removed from the chaotic swirl of producers and managers, the young man sat alone in perfect silence. He was no longer the frightened boy gripping a mop handle in a dusty Texas gas station, but the lines of his face still carried the deep, unyielding humility of his roots. He stared at his reflection in the brightly lit mirror. He wore no rhinestones, no expensive tailored suits, no flashy jewelry to signal his newfound wealth. He wore a simple, faded pearl snap shirt, a pair of well-worn denim jeans, and the exact same scuffed leather boots he had worn on the day his life changed forever. He refused to dress like the arrogant executive who had once tried to destroy him. He wanted the people in the crowd to look at him and see themselves. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the small, weathered leather pouch. His thumb traced the familiar contours of the custom guitar pick, feeling the embossed signature of the man who had pulled him from the wreckage of his own despair. The plastic was warm against his skin, a tangible tether to the miracle that had occurred 5 years ago. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath that filled his lungs with the heavy air of the arena. The journey from the linoleum floor of the dusty Trails Fuel and Stop to the headlining dressing room of a sold-out stadium had been a brutal, grueling crucible. He had bled for every lyric, he had starved for every melody, and he had fought relentlessly against a corporate machine that wanted to polish his rough edges and silence his authentic truth. But he had survived. He had conquered the mountain not by changing who he was, but by leaning entirely into the dirt, the sweat, and the raw honesty of the working class. A soft knock on the wooden door broke his concentration. The door creaked open, and a massive security guard stepped aside to allow an elderly man to enter. It was his grandfather. The old man was dressed in his Sunday best, a faded but meticulously pressed brown suit that smelled faintly of mothballs and Old Spice. He held his worn felt hat in his trembling hands, looking around the luxurious dressing room with wide, tear-filled eyes. The sheer scale of the event, the blinding lights, the frantic energy, it was a world entirely alien to a man who had spent his entire life pulling a living from the unforgiving Texas soil. The young man immediately stood up, crossing the room in 3 long strides, and pulled his grandfather into a fierce, desperate embrace. The old man felt fragile in his arms, his bones sharp beneath the thin fabric of the suit, but his spirit was a towering fortress of pride and faith. "Look at this place, son," the grandfather whispered, his voice cracking with profound emotion as he pulled back to look at his grandson's face. "I never thought my old eyes would live to see the day. I remember you singing to the cows out by the broken fence line. I remember you coming home with your hands blistered and bleeding from that gas station. And now the whole world is waiting out there just to hear you speak." The young man wiped a stray tear from his own cheek, his hands resting on his grandfather's narrow shoulders. "I am only here because of you, Grandpa," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You taught me how to stand tall when the world told me to crawl. You taught me that a man's value is not in his bank account but in his soul. And tonight I am going to sing for every single person who ever felt invisible. I am going to sing for the dirt roads and the empty pockets." The grandfather nodded slowly, a profound peace settling over his weathered features. He reached out and tapped the young man's chest right over his heart. "You go out there and you show them the truth," he said firmly. You show them that the Lord honors a humble heart, and you make sure you thank the man who gave you the key to this kingdom. The stage manager poked his head into the room holding a clipboard, his face pale with the stress of running a massive production. 5 minutes to showtime, he announced, his voice tight. We need you in the tunnel. The young man took one last look in the mirror, adjusted his acoustic guitar strap over his shoulder, and walked out of the dressing room. The walk through the backstage corridors was a chaotic blur of moving equipment, flashing lights, and shouting technicians. But the young man did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew exactly who he was and where he came from. As he approached the final tunnel leading to the stage, he noticed an older man in a grey uniform pushing a wide dust mop across the concrete floor, cleaning up the debris left by the road crew. The janitor looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground, trying to stay out of the way of the important people rushing past him. The young man stopped dead in his tracks, causing the entourage behind him to halt in confusion. He stepped away from his managers and security guards, walking directly over to the janitor. The older man looked up, startled, his eyes widening in shock as the headlining star of the night approached him. The young man did not just nod or wave. He reached out and firmly grasped the janitor's rough, calloused hand, shaking it with deep, genuine respect. "Thank you for your hard work tonight, sir," the young man said, his voice cutting clearly through the backstage noise. "This show does not happen without you keeping this place running. Your work matters to me. I used to push a mop just like that one. Keep your head up." The janitor's jaw dropped, his eyes instantly filling with tears. He gripped the young man's hand tightly, unable to find the words, simply nodding his head in profound gratitude. The young man smiled, patted the man on the shoulder, and turned back toward the tunnel. His managers looked at him in stunned silence, realizing that this was not a PR stunt. This was the absolute, unshakable core of the artist identity. He had not forgotten the heat. He had not forgotten the dirt. He was still one of them. The young man stepped into the darkness of the tunnel, the roar of the crowd growing to an unimaginable volume. The heavy bass from the opening act had faded, replaced by a tense, electrifying anticipation. The arena went completely pitch black. The sudden darkness triggered a deafening explosion of screams, a sonic boom that rattled the young man's ribs. He walked up the metal stairs, his boots clanking against the grating, and stepped onto the massive stage. He stood in the center, enveloped in the darkness, feeling the overwhelming weight of 50,000 pairs of eyes waiting for him. Suddenly, a single blinding white spotlight crashed down from the rafters, illuminating him in a stark, dramatic halo. He stood there, a solitary figure with an acoustic guitar, stripped of all the massive production elements, looking incredibly small, but radiating a towering, undeniable presence. He did not launch immediately into a loud, upbeat anthem. He did not scream into the microphone to hype up the crowd. Instead, he raised his right hand, holding the small custom guitar pickup to the light. The giant video screens flanking the stage zoomed in on his hand, projecting the image of the worn leather pick and the faded signature of George Strait to every corner of the arena. The crowd, recognizing the signature and sensing the gravity of the moment, began to quiet down. The deafening roar subsided into a hushed, reverent silence. The young man leaned into the microphone, his breath echoing through the massive stadium speakers. 5 years ago, I was entirely invisible. He began, his voice raw and trembling with emotion, echoing through the cavernous space. I was a kid, working a minimum wage shift at a gas station in the middle of the Texas desert. I spent my days scrubbing oil off the concrete and mopping up the mud left behind by people who did not even look at me when they handed me their money. I was told by the world that my life had a ceiling. I was told by a very angry, very wealthy man that my dreams were a joke, that my accent was a liability, and that I was going to die with a mop in my hands. He paused, the memory of the cruel executive sneer flashing in his mind. The crowd was dead silent, hanging onto every single syllable. In the front row, his grandfather sat gripping the metal barricade, tears streaming freely down his weathered face. That man humiliated me in front of strangers. The young man continued, his voice dropping to a fierce, passionate whisper. He tried to strip me of my dignity because he believed that the dirt on my boots made me less of a human being. I believed him. I was ready to give up. I was ready to shut my mouth and disappear into the dust. But the Lord works in mysterious ways, because standing in the shadows of that gas station, buying a cup of black coffee, was a man who knew that true greatness is not measured by the brand of your suit, but by the calluses on your hands and the truth in your soul. The young man gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles turning white. That man did not yell. He did not throw a punch. He stepped out of the shadows and he used his legendary voice to shield a broken kid. He sang with me. He put this very guitar pick into my dirty hands, and he told me that my voice mattered. He told me never to let anyone silence me. He gave me my life back. A massive wave of emotion rolled through the crowd. Grown men in cowboy hats wiped their eyes. Women held their hands over their hearts. The story was striking the deepest chords of the human spirit, resonating with every person who had ever been bullied, overlooked, or told they were not enough. I am standing on this stage tonight because George Strait saw a nobody sweeping a floor and decided to treat him like a somebody. The young man declared, his voice soaring with triumphant power. So this next song, my first #1 record, is not just for me. It is for the truck drivers. It is for the waitresses working the graveyard shift. It is for the janitors pushing the mops. And most importantly, it is dedicated to the king of country music, the man who taught me that the most powerful weapon a man can wield is simple, unyielding kindness. The young man stepped back from the microphone and struck the opening chord of Amarillo by Morning on his acoustic guitar. The crowd erupted into a massive, deafening cheer, recognizing the classic anthem. He began to sing, his voice filling the arena with that same raw, piercing beauty that had stopped George Strait in his tracks 5 years ago. He sang with his eyes closed, pouring his entire soul into the lyrics, channeling the heat of the gas station, the pain of his past, and the overwhelming joy of his redemption. He reached the chorus, his voice soaring effortlessly over the roar of the crowd. But as he prepared to sing the next line, something impossible happened. The massive speakers flanking the stage crackled. A second voice, a deep, velvety, unmistakable baritone, rolled through the arena. It was a voice that possessed the gravitational pull of a planet, a voice that had defined the very essence of country music for decades. It wrapped around the young man tenor with absolute breathtaking perfection, harmonizing exactly as it had done in the dusty aisles of the convenience store. The young man's eyes snapped open in sheer shock. The crowd let out a sound that was no longer a cheer. It was a seismic event, a collective explosion of disbelief and pure ecstasy. The stadium physically shook. From the deep shadows of the stage wings, a figure slowly emerged into the blinding glare of the spotlights. He was wearing faded denim jeans, a simple pearl snap shirt, and a well-worn straw hat pulled low over his brow. He walked with the slow, measured, unhurried grace of a true Texas legend. George Strait, holding his own acoustic guitar, stepped up to the center microphone, standing shoulder to shoulder with the young man he had saved. The young man stopped playing, his hands trembling so violently he could no longer hold the pick. He stared at the legend, his jaw slack, tears streaming uncontrollably down his face. He was completely paralyzed, transported instantly back to the frightened boy behind the counter. But George did not stop singing. He looked at the young man, offered that same rare, genuine smile, and gave a slow, firm nod of his head. It was the exact same silent command he had given in the gas station. Stand up. Find your courage. Sing. The young man drew a ragged breath, wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand, and struck the guitar strings with renewed, furious strength. He stepped up to the microphone and joined his voice with the king. For the next 4 minutes, the massive high-tech arena dissolved. It was no longer a corporate-sponsored event. It was a sacred communion between 2 generations of storytellers. The harmony between the seasoned master and the triumphant apprentice was a force of nature, an emotional hurricane that swept through the 50,000 people in attendance. They sang the final chorus together, their voices rising higher and higher, a defiant, glorious anthem against arrogance, against cruelty, and against the darkness that tries to crush the human spirit. When they struck the final ringing chord, the arena exploded into a standing ovation that felt like a localized earthquake. The deafening roar of applause and screaming continued for minutes on end, completely drowning out the sound of the amplifiers. In the front row, the grandfather was weeping openly, holding his hat over his heart, witnessing the absolute vindication of his family bloodline. George Strait took off his straw hat and bowed slightly to the roaring crowd. Then he turned to the young man. The legend did not offer a handshake. He reached out and pulled the weeping young man into a deep, fatherly embrace. The young man buried his face in George's shoulder, sobbing the weight of 5 years of struggle and the overwhelming magnitude of the moment crashing down upon him. George leaned in close, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the deafening noise of the stadium, whispering directly into the young man's ear. "You did not need me to save you, son," George said, his words carrying the heavy, comforting weight of absolute truth. "You had the fire inside you all along. I just helped you light the match. I am proud of you. Now look out there. Look at what you built with your own 2 hands. Do not ever let them take this away from you." George pulled back, gave the young man a firm pat on the back and raised his hat to the crowd one last time. He turned and walked slowly back into the shadows, disappearing as quietly and as humbly as he had arrived, leaving the stage entirely to the young man. The young man stood alone in the center of the blinding light. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the thousands of people holding up their phones and wiping tears from their eyes. He looked down at his grandfather, who was smiling with the peace of a man who knows his legacy is secure. He looked at his own hands, the faint scars and calluses still visible beneath the stage lights. He realized in that profound, transcendent moment that the dirt he had tried so hard to wash away was the very thing that had made him strong. He realized that the arrogant executive in the tailored suit was a prisoner of his own hollow existence, while the boy with the mop had inherited the earth. He raised his worn acoustic guitar high into the air, the custom pick tightly gripped in his hand, the roar of the crowd washing over him like a baptism of fire and grace, a testament to the enduring, unbreakable power of standing up for the broken and giving a voice to the invisible. The roar of the arena did not fade when George Strait disappeared into the dark wings of the stage. Instead, the sound mutated into a living, breathing entity, a physical force that pressed against the young man's chest and made the heavy wooden body of his acoustic guitar vibrate against his ribs. He stood entirely alone in the blinding white circle of the spotlight, but for the first time in his life, he did not feel small. He did not feel like the dirt beneath the boots of wealthy men. He felt the undeniable weight of his own worth anchoring him to the stage. He looked down at his right hand. His fingers were still trembling violently, slick with sweat and the adrenaline of the miracle he had just witnessed. Pinched tightly between his thumb and forefinger, the custom leather guitar pick felt heavier than a gold medal. It was the physical proof that the darkest moments of humiliation could be transformed into the brightest beacons of redemption, if only a single person had the courage to show a little grace. In the front row, the grandfather was no longer sitting. The frail elderly man had pulled himself up, gripping the cold metal of the security barricade with hands that had spent 70 years fighting the unforgiving Texas soil. His knuckles were swollen with arthritis, his skin spotted and scarred from decades of pulling cotton and mending barbed wire in the blistering sun. For his entire life, this old man had been told in a million different unspoken ways that he was at the bottom of the world. He had swallowed his pride when bankers denied his loans. He had tipped his hat to men who looked right through him, and he had prayed every single night on his worn knees that his grandson would not inherit the same invisible chains of poverty and disrespect. Now, as the tears flowed freely down the deep crevices of his weathered face, washing away a lifetime of accumulated dust and sorrow, the old man witnessed the ultimate vindication of his bloodline. The king of country music had not merely shared a stage with his boy. George Strait had validated the very soul of their family. The grandfather raised his trembling hand toward the stage, pointing a single crooked finger at the young man. It was a silent, fiercely proud gesture that communicated everything words could never capture. It said, "You did it, my boy, you broke the cycle." Backstage in the concrete tunnels far away from the blinding lights and the deafening applause, the older janitor in the gray uniform had completely stopped working. He stood in front of a small, glowing production monitor mounted on the cinder-block wall, his wide dust mop resting forgotten against his hip. He watched the screen with wide, disbelieving eyes as the young man who had shaken his hand just minutes before stood triumphant in the center of the arena. The janitor had spent 20 years cleaning up the messes left behind by famous people. He had been yelled at, ignored, pushed aside, and treated as if he were part of the architecture. But tonight, the biggest star in the building had looked him directly in the eye and thanked him for his labor. And then that same star had stood in front of 50,000 people and dedicated his crowning achievement to the people who pushed the mops. A hot, heavy tear slipped down the janitor's rough cheek. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, his chest swelling with a profound, unfamiliar emotion. Dignity. He gripped the wooden handle of his mop, not with the tired resignation of a defeated man, but with the firm pride of a man who knew his work was essential. The young man and George Strait had reminded him that the ground he swept was just as important as the stage they sang on. Hundreds of miles away in a cold, sterile high-rise apartment in a bustling metropolis, the arrogant executive sat alone in the dark. The walls of his penthouse were made of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of a city that did not care if he lived or died. He wore a silk robe and held a crystal glass of expensive scotch, but his eyes were hollow, staring blankly at the glowing screen of his tablet. His social media feed was exploding with viral clips of the concert. He tapped on a video, and the sound of the young man's soaring tenor harmonizing with the legendary baritone of George Strait filled the empty, expensive room. The executive watched the screen, his stomach twisting into a painful, sickening knot. He recognized the boy. He recognized the exact face of the teenager he had ruthlessly mocked and humiliated in that dusty roadside gas station 5 years ago. He remembered the cruel words he had spat, the way he had told the boy he would die a nobody. The crushing weight of his own profound insignificance crashed down upon the executive. He had spent his entire life chasing money, stepping on the throats of the vulnerable, believing that his imported cars and tailored suits made him a god among insects. But as he watched the boy, he had tried to destroy commanding the love and respect of a sold-out stadium, standing shoulder to shoulder with a true American icon. The executive realized the terrifying truth of his own existence. He was a hollow shell. He had no legacy. No one would ever cheer for him. No one would ever cry tears of joy for his successes. He had built a fortress of wealth, but he was entirely, utterly alone, trapped in a prison of his own arrogance. He set the crystal glass down on the marble table, his hands shaking, and buried his face in his hands, haunted forever by the ghost of the boy he had tried to bury in the dust. Back in the arena, the deafening roar of the crowd finally began to settle, shifting from an explosive cheer into a steady, rhythmic clapping. The young man stepped back up to the microphone, his heart pounding a steady, triumphant rhythm against his ribs. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the thousands of glowing cell phone lights that looked like a galaxy of stars brought down to Earth. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of ozone sweat and the undeniable electricity of human connection. He did not need a script. He did not need a teleprompter. The words he was about to sing had been carved into his bones by the blistering heat of the Texas sun and the cold cruelty of a stranger. He strummed the acoustic guitar, the sound ringing out clear and pure, cutting through the heavy air. "This next song is one I wrote myself," he said, his voice steady and resonant, projecting to the very last row of the upper decks. "I wrote it on the back of a greasy receipt paper, sitting on the bumper of a broken-down truck. It is a song about the things you cannot buy. It is about the calluses on your hands, the faith in your heart, and the absolute unbreakable power of a stranger grace. It is called The Dust and the Crown." He closed his eyes and began to sing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a perfect blend of traditional country storytelling and raw, soaring emotion. He sang about a boy sweeping a floor while dreaming of the sky. He sang about a man in a suit who tried to steal his light and a quiet cowboy in a straw hat who gave it back. Every lyric was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a declaration that the most beautiful flowers grow from the hardest dirt. The crowd was mesmerized, swaying in unison, completely captivated by the absolute authenticity of the performance. There were no flashing lasers, no backup dancers, no manufactured drama. There was only a man, a guitar, and a truth so powerful it shattered the walls of the arena and reached directly into the souls of everyone listening. As the young man sang, his grandfather closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, a silent prayer of gratitude leaving his lips. The janitor in the hallway leaned against the cinder-block wall, tapping his heavy boot to the rhythm, a soft smile playing on his face. The truck drivers, the waitresses, the mechanics, and the farmers in the audience held their heads a little higher, their own struggles validated and honored by the boy on the stage. The music became a bridge connecting every broken heart and every exhausted pair of hands in the room, forging a bond of shared humanity that transcended class, wealth, and status. While the arena burned with the fire of the young man's redemption, a lone pickup truck drove steadily down a dark, empty stretch of Texas highway. The night was pitch black, the only illumination coming from the sweep of the headlights, cutting through the thick, humid air and the soft green glow of the dashboard dials. George Strait sat behind the wheel, his worn straw hat resting on the passenger seat, his dark sunglasses tucked away. The windows were rolled down, letting the warm wind rush through the cab, carrying the sharp, earthy scent of dry sagebrush and the distant promise of rain. He was miles away from the blinding lights, the screaming fans, and the chaotic machinery of the music industry. He was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the vast, quiet majesty of the land that had shaped him. George reached out with a calloused hand and turned the dial on the old radio. The static crackled for a moment before locking onto a clear signal. It was a live country music broadcast, syndicating the concert from the arena. The cab of the truck was instantly filled with the sound of the young man's voice, singing the final soaring chorus of his original song. George rested his elbow on the open window frame, steering with one hand, listening intently to the lyrics. He heard the strength in the boy voice, the unshakable confidence that had replaced the fear and the shame. He heard the echoes of his own influence, not as a boastful triumph, but as a quiet passing of the torch. A slow, genuine smile spread across George's weathered face. He did not need to be on that stage to feel the impact of what had happened. He did not need the applause or the recognition. For George, the greatest reward was not a platinum record or a sold-out stadium. The greatest reward was knowing that he had used his platform to protect the vulnerable, to lift up a broken spirit, and to remind the world that a man's true worth is measured by how he treats those who can do absolutely nothing for him. He had seen a spark in the darkness of a dirty gas station, and he had cupped his hands around it, protecting it from the wind until it grew into a roaring fire. The young man hit the final majestic note of the song, his voice ringing out with absolute flawless clarity, holding it until the very last breath left his lungs. The radio broadcast exploded, with the sound of 50,000 people losing their minds, screaming their lungs out for the boy who had conquered the world. George listened to the thunderous applause, his smile deepening. He reached over and gently turned the volume knob down, letting the roar of the crowd fade into a soft background hum. He looked up through the windshield at the endless expanse of the Texas night sky, blanketed with millions of glittering stars. He felt the deep, profound peace of a man who had lived his life according to the unbreakable values of his faith and his heritage. He pressed his boot down on the accelerator, the engine of the pickup truck, letting out a low, powerful growl as it ate up the miles of dark asphalt. The king of country music drove onward into the quiet night, asking for no praise, seeking no glory, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the ages, not just in the songs he sang, but in the lives he saved.